Welcome to the training for the Minnesota Youth Human Trafficking and Exploitation Tool and Guide. Trauma-informed and survivor-informed practices to identify youth who have experienced human trafficking or exploitation. Throughout this training, we refer to this as the MYTEI Tool. All professionals and agencies must complete this webinar prior to using the guide. It is highly recommended that a basic training on human trafficking and exploitation be taken before taking this training, as we do not cover basic definitions or dynamics of human trafficking and exploitation. This PowerPoint and training was produced by the Minnesota Department of Health under 2019 NZ NX 0031, awarded by the Office for Victims of Crime, Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this PowerPoint are those of the contributors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Our presenters are Amanda Colgrove, Safe Harbor Expansion Coordinator, Minnesota Department of Health, Bukola Oriola, Executive Director, The Eniton Story, Michael Pittman, Safe Harbor Case Manager, Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center, and Tasha Scott, Safe Harbor Grant Manager, Minnesota Department of Health. We will first provide an overview and background on the tool and guide. More detailed information about how this resource was developed can be found in the introductory section of the guide. Once this training is completed, you will be directed to a place where you can download the MYTEI Tool and Guide.
This is advice from youth who have participated in Voices of Safe Harbor. Quote, sometimes you have to ask questions before jumping to conclusions. You have to ask what their story is and how they ended up doing this. Quote, I feel like you need to know for sure that you can trust the person with what you tell them. Quote, let them know you are there for them and they will open up to you over time, and that's how you learn how to help them. Throughout the training, we will be using quotes such as these from youth, survivors, and service providers. The MYTEI purpose is to act as an identification tool for youth ages 13 to 17 for labor and sex trafficking and labor and sexual exploitation. Also, this is for use by youth serving agencies and providers who are trained professionals working with youth and have completed using the MYTEI webinar.
The MYTEI Tool and Guide will help Minnesota organizations be consistent in talking about and responding to human trafficking. It is a survivor-centered and trauma-informed intervention tool. It has been developed for use in Minnesota to identify minors who have experienced or are experiencing human trafficking and/or exploitation. This will identify both labor trafficking and exploitation, but it is not a universal screening tool, nor is it a checklist. It is designed to be administered conversationally through interactions with youth. Before using the guide, there are requirements of due diligence. Use is voluntary, and it is important to use the guide and tool as intended. The identification process can be re-traumatizing. This guide provides strategies on how to minimize that risk. First, determine if you need to use this guide by assessing agency and provider fit and readiness. The guide should not be used if an agency and the provider is not committed to becoming familiar with the guide, which includes a thorough reading. This should be followed by making necessary changes, such as developing an agency response plan and assessing internal policies, such as record keeping and mandated reporting policies.
MYTEI content and structure. The tool is divided into the following sections: acknowledgement and introduction. Before using the guide, how to know if you should use the MYTEI tool, elements of implementing an identification process, indicators of human trafficking or exploitation, identification of human trafficking or exploitation of youth ages 13 to 17.
Throughout the webinar, more information will be provided about what is in the guide. As you listen, think about how your agency and how you as a provider will use this tool as designed. It is okay to have the tool viewable while talking to a youth. However, the tool should act as a reference, not an interview checklist. The guide does not contain or recommend a specific comprehensive assessment tool or interview protocol. It may be helpful to develop strategies that work for you to remember key details. For example, the youth mentioned a debt or working outside normal hours for their age.
There are important considerations for use. There are important considerations for using this tool. Read the guide in its entirety before using. Prioritize youth safety and well-being. Assess agency responsibilities. Assess provider responsibilities. And ensure cultural and linguistically responsive practice.
How you use this guide is very important. How you interact and connect with youth matters significantly when using the guide. Agency policies, staff support, and response plans will impact how effectively this guide is used in practice. Listen closely to the slides outlining effective use.
There are important considerations for using this tool. I did that already, sorry. Prioritizing youth safety and well-being means pay attention to youth, pause, reflect, and discontinue. And discontinue conversation if youth is stressed or wants to stop. Pay attention to yourself. Ensure you are ready and able. Use affirming and approachable language. Here is a quote from a service provider. Some of these youths are coming off the streets. Detention, may be chemically dependent and are experiencing a trauma response.
It is common for survivors of trafficking to have a lifetime history of trauma. Understand that complex trauma is cumulative and ongoing, rather than an isolated incident. Be prepared to handle a trauma reaction in case a question triggers a memory of abuse or violence and causes a flashback or panic attack. It is important to give the client the time and space needed before proceeding. On page 19 of the guide, there are 5 questions to help providers and agencies prioritize youth safety and well-being. 1. Have you completed the MDH webinar on the identification process and have experience with trauma-informed care? 2. Is this likely the only time you will be able to identify possible trafficking or exploitation with them? 3. Are you in a location where it is safe to have a conversation about these experiences with the youth? 4. Is the person in a physical and mental state that will allow for a conversation about their experiences? 5. If the youth is new to you and appears more guarded, ask if there is another person with whom they would be more comfortable speaking. Reflect and consider these questions as you interact and have conversations with youth. If a provider does not have the time and space, it may not be the best time to have a conversation.
Agency responsibilities are to create internal response guide. Agency responsibilities are to create internal response guidance, privacy and confidentiality, mandated reporting, record keeping, cultural and linguistic considerations, ensure staff are trained, provide support and supervision. The Minnesota Department of Human Services has a resource for mandated reporting and online training.
Agencies that work with youth who have risk factors for trafficking or exploitation are highly encouraged to incorporate the MYTEI tool into their protocols. Agency responsibilities are outlined on pages 7 through 16 of the guide. Before using the tool within your organization, best practice is to create a step-by-step plan of action in the event of a positive identification that prioritizes the physical and emotional safety of youth and providers. A good working relationship with a youth depends on building trust and protecting privacy whenever possible. State and federal laws, as well as professional codes and agency protocols, provide guidance about when information can and cannot be shared. Utilize releases of information when sharing, identifying details. Mandated reporting laws are intended to increase the safety of the youth and community by connecting potential victims to protective services and perpetrators to law enforcement. Please see the Minnesota Department of Human Services Resource Guide for Mandated Reporters of Child Protection Concerns for more detailed guidance on mandated reporting. DHS has online training on mandated reporting, which includes guidance on when and how to report sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. Confidentiality, informed consent, and privacy policies should be tightly integrated with an agency's trafficking and exploitation response plan. Cultural considerations are respectful of the beliefs, practices, culture, and language needs of diverse populations and communities. It describes the ability to respond to the needs of diverse individuals. Vicarious trauma is a risk in this type of work, and agencies should be intentional about addressing this challenging aspect of the day-to-day work. Self-care strategies are important in establishing and maintaining well-being.
Provider responsibilities are to be familiar with MYTEI Guide, assess training and education needs, self-reflect on biases and work to change them, identify internal and external resources. Here is a quote from a service provider. Providers are the dots that connect survivors to solutions, not the solution.
As a provider, you may need additional training and education. For example, learning about the dynamics of human trafficking or trauma-informed care for trafficking victims. Recognize how your own language and bias may impact youth safety and well-being. It is important to create an environment of reflection without shaming in order to recognize individual, organization, and system biases. After reflection, agencies and providers must take the time and space to address biases. Reach out to the Safe Harbor network of services, as well as other local professionals, agencies, and tribes to establish cross-sector partnerships and collaborations that will enhance efforts to meet the vast and complex needs of those identified.
When we respect diversity, be inclusive, and affirm all identities, then services will be more effective. Youth will have better experiences. Here is a quote from Voices of Safe Harbor. Spend 24 hours with us and see what it's like to be Black and living in poverty, and on top of that, be trans or queer. They have to be open. They can't bring their badge. Have an open heart.
Human trafficking and exploitation cannot be viewed in isolation from societal harms. To respect the diversity of individuals experiencing human trafficking or exploitation, it is important to use the cultural considerations section to determine if this is the correct tool or if it can be used with modifications.
Let's discuss communicating and language access, including working with interpreters and communicating with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Here is a quote from a service provider. Listening is a communication tool that may be easily ignored. Listen to understand how to communicate with the client.
First, determine if an interpreter is needed. Ask the youth if they want an interpreter or would like to speak for themselves. Agencies should have interpreter services as part of their resource protocol before using the MYTEI tool so they can find language interpretation quickly. A quote from a service provider, sometimes the clients do not need an interpreter. Help the client build confidence to speak for themselves. Encourage the client to speak slowly, and when crying, to pause speaking so that the person they are speaking to, for example, a judge, can hear and understand them. Special considerations are necessary when communicating with those with hearing loss. What works for one individual may not work for another. As in other areas, do not make assumptions about a youth's ability or preferences or what type of service a youth needs. Always ask. Be prepared with different options for clients like sign language interpreters, voice translators, if over the phone, and other options.
Cultural considerations for American Indian youth. American Indian women and youth are overrepresented in the victim population. We acknowledge that there are several marginalized groups overrepresented in the victim population, but we want to spend some time talking about American Indians both because of their particular vulnerability and because there are 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota. History of trauma by colonizers. Due to the long history of genocide, historical and intergenerational trauma, displacement, confinement, boarding schools, sterilization, and assimilation tactics perpetuated against American Indian tribes by the colonizers, American Indian communities and families are distrustful of the system that attempted to annihilate them. Tribal nations in Minnesota. It is important to note that there are 11 sovereign tribes within the boundaries of Minnesota, which include 4 Dakota Sioux communities and 7 Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Ojibwe reservations. Tribal affiliation is not a racial category, but a deep connection to lifeways, ceremonies, and medicinal practices that are unique to that tribe. American Indian may be enrolled members of or eligible for enrollment in one of the 11 federally recognized tribes within Minnesota or any of the other 573 federally recognized tribes throughout the United States. They may also be a part of an American Indian community that is not federally recognized as a tribe. This may be especially true for First Nation members whose tribal status is rooted in Canada. American Indians and First Nation families live throughout Minnesota. The majority live in urban areas and primarily receive services through urban organizations, while others live on reservations and receive services from the tribe. Due to the political status of American Indian, First Nation, and tribal lands, be aware that there are multiple topics a culturally informed professional or community expert will need to know. This includes knowledge of legal and jurisdictional concerns. Tribal nations have the authority to develop their own laws. Work with the tribes. Learn about the youth's home, community, family, and kinship ties. Build trust and rapport. Connect your youth with local cultural resources if residing off reservation. Contact Indian Child Welfare and ask youth if they are enrolled in a tribe. A professional or community person working with an American Indian youth who has been trafficked or sexually exploited must have knowledge of the youth's home, community, family, and kinship ties. This will help the worker build the trust and rapport to effectively work with the youth and family. Many tribal nations in Minnesota are developing specific responses, training, and resources for American Indian youth who are experiencing trafficking and exploitation. Tribal governments and American Indian serving organizations should be consulted when assessing local and regional resources for American Indian youth. Make sure this is a part of the resources for learning about these nuances. Applying key lessons learned, guidance from the field. Over time, this work has evolved. Survivor leaders, youth serving agencies, direct service providers, social service agencies, and other systems have worked together to address human trafficking and exploitation. Over the years, the understanding and importance of survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally and linguistically responses has grown. Applying key lessons learned is part of the required due diligence when using this tool and guide.
First, do no harm. People of color are disproportionately impacted. Recognize the intended and unintended impact providers and agencies may have. Meet youth where they're at, not where you want them to be. Many systems involved youth have not been treated fairly or respectfully by system providers, particularly if they are youth of color, LGBTQ+, have a disability, or have mental health issues. Don't judge youth against your own experience, culture, values. Administer conversationally. Before the conversation, provide information about what the conversation will involve. During conversations, you should remain calm, use an empathetic tone of voice, and show care and concern for the youth. After having a conversation with the youth, say, "Thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for trusting me." If it seems you are not connecting with the youth, ask, "I don't think I'm getting what you are saying. What don't I understand?"
Normalize the youth's responses. Many times they're afraid to share things due to shame or stigma, and when they do, it's so important to normalize what they're going through, feelings, etc. Define exploitation and trafficking to make sure they fully understand what they are saying, what you are saying to them. Tell them that sex trafficking is mandated reports. If it is true, let them know that they don't need to disclose to work with you or get safe harbor services.
Youth autonomy and empowerment. Explaining confidentiality and informed consent builds trust and help youth take back control by not feeling pressured to share information. Find simple ways to give the youth a sense of control.
Many individuals who have been trafficked have had all controls taken from them by their trafficker, so offering as much choice as possible can help build trust. Identifying human trafficking or exploitation can unintentionally result in decisions being made on behalf of the person perceived to be vulnerable, without regards for that person's knowledge of what will keep them safe or cause further harm. To avoid endangering individuals who have been trafficked or exploited, professionals should allow their clients as much control over decisions as possible and a clear explanation of when they might be required to act without the youth's consent, as in the case of mandated reporting. Here's some tips. Simple ways to promote youth's sense of control include allowing them to choose where they would like to sit, or allowing them to choose from a variety of available snacks while they wait, or letting them know where the bathrooms are located so that they don't feel like they have to ask when needed. Giving youth a detailed explanation of what mandated reporting is and the potential risk of sharing information that might be reported and all potential outcomes, then letting them be part of the process will also provide them with a sense of empowerment.
Collaboration is essential. Collaboration is a way to have honest and meaningful conversations about different viewpoints and perspectives. Collaboration is a give and take. Be willing to be helpful to cultural providers as much as you are seeking help from them. Effective collaborations improve services for youth.
Reach out to the Safe Harbor network of services, as well as other local professionals, agencies, and tribes to establish cross-sector partnerships and collaborations that will enhance efforts to meet the vast and complex needs of those identified. Minnesota's Safe Harbor No Wrong Door model creates a network of services for youth who have experienced sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. Safe Harbor regional navigators should be a key contact for agencies to assess available resources for individual youth who have experienced trafficking or exploitation. Here's a quote from a service provider. "Remember that collaboration is give and take. Otherwise, you will run into distrust and challenges if you don't show support and mutual respect."
Self-reflect. Take time to reflect on your own biases, as an agency, as an individual. Be willing to change, learn, and adapt new approaches.
The next section of the webinar will be a guided practice using the MYTEI sections on indicators and identification. Conversations rarely go according to a model, but this will provide an example of how to take the questions from the tool and put them into real-life situations.
The foundations for successful identification are rooted in connecting with youth. Foundations of successful identification build trust and rapport. Take your time. Listen to youth and what they want to share. Allow youth to talk at own pace. Stop conversation if youth is distressed.
Before we start the guided practice, think about the information provided so far and what it means to connect with youth. Remember to reflect on the 5 questions we referenced earlier from the guide. Youth may have a healthy sense of mistrust. Don't contradict their facts or press for information about the trafficker. Here are some quotes from service providers. Youth may or may not want to work with someone from their culture or community. Understand this when it happens and try to connect them to another provider that they may feel more comfortable working with. Check on yourself to see when your frustration is showing. For example, you may be frustrated that they are not following through with services, and it can be frustrating. Be mindful of that. It may make youth to withdraw. This guide does not include a high-risk checklist, but does include a list of indicators that are meant to be used in combination. Risk factors are not the same as indicators. Risk factors are environmental conditions like poverty, gender, and cultural norms that put someone at a greater probability of experiencing a particular outcome. Frequent running away, homelessness, truancy, LGBTQIA identity, disability, lack of immigration status, and poverty are other common risk factors that may make a youth more vulnerable to trafficking or exploitation. Indicators are a youth's reported experiences or situations that point to or indicate the possibility of human trafficking. Signs alone do not necessarily specify trafficking or exploitation. Usually, more information is required, but indicators are a useful starting point. The indicators can be found on page 16 of the guide and are grouped into the categories listed on slide 26.
Using the MYTEI tool. Indicators of trafficking and exploitation. Signs of being controlled. Living conditions. Physical and psychological signs of trauma. Working conditions. Relationships. Activities. Possessions. The identification tool. Labor exploitation questions. We will be focusing on the following questions from the tool for the first guided practice. The question, is the youth working or has worked in an unsafe environment? Late at night, early in the morning, or during school hours? Under the age of 14, and or has the youth had trouble getting paid? If the youth answers yes to any of these questions, here are your next steps. Address immediate safety concerns. Connect to relevant worker justice organizations. Connect to the U.S. Department of Labor, Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, or civil attorney for legal remedies.
Guided practice. Labor exploitation, the setting for this scenario, is youth, 16 years of age, no identifying documents, English is not their first language, and lives in Greater Minnesota. Youth is experiencing, lives with their extended family in an apartment over a restaurant in 1 to 2 rooms. The restaurant pays the landlord directly for rent, and they are able to keep leftover cash. The provider-youth connection. Youth experienced an injury from the restaurant and went to a neighborhood clinic. The connection is with the healthcare provider at a community clinic.
These are potential indicators present in this scenario. Working conditions. Pay is taken for housing, long hours, owes a debt to employer or person they work for. They work for housing. Was recruited for work under false promises. Signs of being controlled. Immigration status is used in a threatening and coercive way. Threat of deportation.
Beginning the conversation. Thank you for coming in today. I know you were at the clinic today to get an injury taken care of.
I'm really worried because I don't have insurance and I want to make sure I can pay the bill. I'm worried how expensive it will be.
That is hard when you have to worry about money. We do have a sliding scale. Do you have a couple of minutes to chat?
Well, okay, I can talk for a couple of more minutes.
Identifying exploitation, part 1. Tell me more about your pay situation so we can help you figure out how much your bill will be.
My family and I all work. Whatever's left over after rent is ours to keep. I can probably pay the bill off of that. I just want to take care of this injury myself.
Can you share more about where you work?
It is a restaurant. Our apartment is right above it.
When do you work?
I work during the day when we open and I stay until we close.
How are you getting paid? Do you ever have trouble getting paid?
The restaurant owner pays the landlord. I don't get a check. Sometimes I get a little extra cash after the rent is paid.
Do you feel like you have to work?
Yes, my whole family works and I have to support my family. We pay our rent by working. I don't have any other documents to prove that I can get a job. This is my only option.
Are you able to go to school?
I'm 16, so I can work most of the day. I finished 10th grade, but now I just work. I'm afraid that I will get in trouble if I show up to school without any papers.
Thank you for taking the time to talk with me. May I ask you one more question?
Sure.
What are you most concerned about right now?
I may not have enough money to pay this bill right now. I work, but my paychecks goes to my boss who pays the landlord for rent. I don't know how much I'll have left over. I can't lose my job because then we won't have any place to live.
I'm concerned for you, your family, and living situation. There are places that may be able to help.
I'm just not sure.
I know of an agency that might be able to help and give you some options. Would you be willing to talk to someone? And can I help you connect with the resources? We can set up an appointment based on your work schedule.
Not right now. Can I come back and talk with you?
Of course, absolutely. Again, thank you for sharing. You and your family's safety is important.
A note on resources and referrals. You may be able to still offer a resource list and refer to labor trafficking direct service providers, including immigration legal services found in the MYTEI Tool and Guide. Assess if it is safe to give resources and referrals. Do you have internal policies on safety planning with clients when/how to give referrals? A few final reminders. Signs alone do not indicate trafficking. Access for language access. Youth may feel like they can speak for themselves and don't need or want an interpreter. Be authentic in your communication and mirror the youth language where appropriate. Be sure that your nonverbal cues continue to express acceptance and a non-judgmental attitude.
The identification tool, sex trafficking questions. We'll be focusing on the following questions from the tool for the second guided practice. The question: has the youth had to do sexual activities for food, a place to stay, money, help, or anything else for survival? Has the youth had sex or sexual contact for anything of value that another person set up? And or has anyone other than the youth benefited or profited from the youth having sex or sexual contact with another person? Has the youth felt unable to leave or stop the work or sexual activities because of debt, money issues, or needing shelter, or fear around immigration status? If the youth answers yes to any of these questions, here are the next steps. Address immediate safety concerns. Contact a Safe Harbor Regional Navigator to connect youth with relevant supportive services or shelter/housing. Make a mandated child protection report within 24 hours, regardless of youth's relationship with trafficking. This includes an unknown. Guided practice, sex trafficking and exploitation. The setting for the scenario is youth is part of a community-based diversion program, under 16, gender non-conforming, lives in a smaller metro area. Youth is experiencing, they are isolated from their family and are living with a relative. As part of a programming, they are having conversations around consent, healthy sexuality in a support group. The youth must support themselves, and a friend has shared with this youth that there is a way to make money. There are parties where they can meet people to make money or to get things they need: drugs, food, personal supplies, etc. Provider youth connection. Already connected to community-based diversion program and has assigned probation officer they report to. Potential indicators present, sex trafficking and exploitation. As we go through the second scenario, listen for indicators based on this list. Physical and psychological signs of trauma. Youth comes in with an extra phone, hypervigilant, and is on edge. Owes a debt to employer or person they work for housing. Isolates themselves from friends and family, quick shift in appearance. Living conditions. Lives with people who are not their parents or legal guardians. Relationships. Inappropriate relationship with an older adult who the youth views as a friend. Rapid increase in friends. Activities. Use of social media, multiple accounts, hypervigilance with phone, and has multiple phones.
Beginning the conversation. The youth and provider have a relationship and have developed some trust. This conversation is taking place in their weekly one-on-one session.
Hey, Samantha, do you want a pop or snacks? Grab some on the counter.
I already told you my name is Sam.
That's right. You mentioned that at our group meeting last week. Excuse me, I'm sorry. You go by Sam and use they, them.
Yeah, thanks.
This is our first one-on-one meeting since group last week. Nothing formal. I just want to see how things are going.
It's been okay. I'm tired of meeting with a bunch of caseworkers. Ever since I got in trouble, everyone is trying to control my life and is in my business. Every time I go to school, someone wants to talk with me. One of my relatives keep nagging me about my phone and keep asking why I'm always on my phone.
I promise this won't be a nagging conversation. Tell me about your week.
Nothing much, just hanging out with friends. I've been to a couple of parties.
Tell me about those parties.
They are house parties at the older brother of my friend's house.
How old is your friend's brother?
He's in his 20s.
Sounds like you are making some new friends. We talked about relationships and friendships in our last session. How would you describe your friendship with the older brother?
I don't want to talk about who he is. They are helping me make some extra money.
How are they helping you make extra money?
They gave me some money to just hang out with them for a while, you know?
You don't have to answer any of my questions, and I'm not here to judge you. Do you have to do sexual things to get the money or other things when you hang out with them, with these folks?
Yes. Sometimes I do things I don't always want to do, but I need the money and stuff. I have no support from my family.
Well, I'm so glad you shared. Thank you. I know how hard it can be to share things like this.
It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be.
If this is what you're going to be doing, do you know how to access condoms, medical care, and STD testing? I know some places where you can get resources to make sure you're staying safe. If you like, I can connect you to them.
I just don't want to get into more trouble. I don't want to get anyone else in trouble. How can I be sure the resources is safe?
This is part of their job, and it's what they do. They work with people your age, and they know about different resources in the community.
All right, I guess so.
I'm going to give you information to a regional navigator. You can call on your own, or I can make the call with you and introduce you to someone I trust.
Let's call together.
Final reminders 2. Consider indicators in combination, not alone. Meet the person's physical needs. Offer a snack and/or a drink. Show where the restrooms are. Periodically ask if they need anything or if you can get them anything. Youth may be gender nonconforming. Ask how they want to be referred to. Everyone makes mistakes. Say, "Thank you for correcting me," and move on. Allow the youth to set the pace of the conversation. Don't press for details. Final reminders 3. Don't make assumptions. Many youth may not identify as a victim. Building trust and rapport takes time. Due diligence may require familiarizing yourself with agency policies that could apply in youth interactions. Know your confidentiality and mandated reporting obligations. Be open with the youth about these things. Know in advance how to safety plan and explain next.
Conclusion. Thank you for taking the time to go through this training. We'll wrap up with just a few more points. Our aim is to increase the identification of youth who have experienced trafficking without increasing the harm that has been done to them. This requires intentional work on your part. This includes your due diligence of reading the MYTEI guide, listen for both labor and sexual trafficking and exploitation, respect the diversity of individuals, and know mandated reporting laws and agency policies on this. We would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to the work group members who devoted so much of their time to developing the MYTEI tool and guide and this training. Bukola Oriola, The Aniton Story, Terry Ferlitti, Breaking Free, Shauna McBride, American Indian Family Center, Irene Churchill, American Indian Family Center, Madeline Lohman, the Advocates for Human Rights, and from the Minnesota Department of Human Services, Sarah Ladd and Darianne McCormick, and from the Minnesota Department of Health, Tasha Scott, Paula Schaefer, Caroline Palmer, and Amanda Colgrove. The guide provides an extensive list of further resources in the appendices. These hyperlinked resources on the slide are just an example of what you can find in the guide. The Cultural Orientation Resource Center, the Office for Victims of Crime Faces of Human Trafficking video series, Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, and the Minnesota Department of Health Safe Harbor. Thank you for your attention. You will now be directed to a place where you can download the MYTEI tool and guide.